Thank you very much for coming. And my theme today for the next 45 minutes, at least something I've been asked to talk about, would be competition and cooperation. Probably end up saying much more about cooperation and competition, but I hope not to disappoint. So first, let me share the bad news. I think that we have lost the plot. By we, I refer mostly to those of us who in one way or another feel a relationship of some kind, intellectual, spiritual, or professional one, with social democracy or socialism. And by the plot, I not just mean our overall understanding of the dynamics of the digital economy and digital capitalism, but also of capitalism as such, and of the role that social democracy and socialism actually supposed to play in counterbalancing it or countering it. Let me try to unpack this very concise statement. I think that it's very easy for us, especially given this debate about the big tech in Silicon Valley, it's very easy for us to get a false sense of priorities and values that should be informing a social democratic or socialist project under current conditions. It's definitely true that social democrats and socialists have traditionally worried about questions of power, questions of rule of law, questions of legality, but those have never been the top items on the socialist and the social democratic agenda. Rather, the values that actually drove the development of the social democratic and socialist project have always been those of egalitarianism, social justice, equality, and I would argue, in a very maybe counterintuitive way, those of institutional innovation. And I think this last bit of institutional innovation is not fully understood, even by those inside the social democratic and socialist project themselves. But I would argue that it's precisely by inventing new institutional forms, new practices, that social democracy has managed to achieve so much. Some of those practices and institutions we know and recognize under the name of the welfare state. Some of them we know and recognize under different practices and names, such as the right to co-determination or Mitbestimmung, as you call it in German. Some of them we know as just institutions that exist somewhere in between the welfare system and capitalism. Think, for example, of the library system. Right? It's clearly an institution that works on an ethos and works on rationality that is different from that of the market. Right? We do not try to encourage competition between 50 different libraries in order to produce the best results. We recognize that this is perhaps a public good, which requires an infrastructure and adequate spending, and we use that public good in order to promote a set of values that we hold dear. Some of those values have to do with the very concepts I have outlined before: solidarity, cooperation, egalitarianism. Right? But we assume that our background, our class, should not be an obstacle to us accessing certain resources. But I would argue that the social democratic and socialist project actually underplays its strongest arguments, in that many of these interventions, from the welfare state to co-determination to institutions like the library, were not just about promoting egalitarianism and solidarity. They were also about introducing a more efficient and effective way for society to function, and to actually promote quite a bit of social and actual economic innovation. Right? The reason why we had the welfare state was not partially to make the playing field level, right? Not to level it and to make everything accessible to everybody, but it was also partly because we believed that it was truly the most efficient and effective way to structure relations in a society so that people with something to say and something to contribute can take full advantage of the resources available to them and have their say in how society is governed, how it's shaped, and contribute something to it. To some extent, this long history of social innovations that the social democratic project has unleashed, it's almost got forgotten in the last few decades as the main task of social democracy has become that of defending whatever is left of those institutions against the neoliberal assault. So much of the intellectual and ideational content of social democracy has become quite defensive, has become about defending the institutions we have created and set up a long time ago against cuts, against assaults by all sorts of neoliberal institutions, bureaucrats, and others who've been put in government and other institutions in order to shrink or eliminate them. That, I think, has had a very detrimental effect on the capacity of social democratic and socialist forces to actually think about technological change and to think about the kinds of institutional innovations that would be needed in order to hack that set of forces and redirect them towards a more egalitarian, productive, but also more efficient and effective deployment, like social democracy has done in the past with other forces. I know that this might sound very abstract, so I will try to make it as concrete as possible with my examples, but I think we really have to recognize, right, that there is something about social democracy and socialism which presupposes a very different way of thinking than traditional frameworks of competition, for example, would suggest, which in Europe at least are traditionally associated with the liberal project and Christian democracy and not with social democracy. Right? Social democracy here has traditionally meant something very different, has meant a very different set of values, and it has meant actually building institutions that could make those values present in society and could make them resilient and robust. Now, what does it mean here and now in 2019? Well, we face a number of constraints on our capacity to engage in the kind of social and institutional innovation that would allow us to keep those values resilient and present in society at large. So the conditions of possibility, if you will, for keeping the social democratic project alive are being undermined and they're not present. And the threats to them, to those conditions of possibility, come from many fronts at once. They come from the tempo and the structure of global capitalism as such, from the fact that there is just too much idle capital lying around after the financial crisis, searching an outlet that would guarantee it a return of at least 6 or 7%. Many of those institutions, as you well know, are not the rapacious hedge funds that are pillaging various companies and institutions, but they are the very pension funds that were set up by the very social democratic forces that many of us represent and are affiliated with. Right? So the problems that have to be addressed, they are not easy to represent as a set of enemies versus a set of people on our side. Right? There is not such a blank distinction to be made because many of the pension funds that are currently investing money in the likes of Facebook or in the likes of Google, in the likes of Amazon, are the very pension funds that actually guarantee your pension in many cases. Not necessarily in Germany, but in many other places, including in Europe, that's definitely the case. And unless there is an easy way out of this debacle that the global economy has been in for the last 10 years, since the crisis began, you should not expect that structural condition to somehow go away and change. There will still be quite a lot of people who cannot get the money they were expecting to get from anywhere other than technology startups and technology platforms. Right? This all but ensures that this idle capital chasing a return will always be the background condition with which we'll have to contend. So, of course, we can dismiss the idea of building some kind of a European fund to invest in European technology companies. We can dismiss it as some kind of too hierarchical, too draconian, or too authoritarian. But the reality is that those $200 billion that are standing idle, eager to be invested in anything that will guarantee a return, that would not go away as a structural condition that we have to confront. And we have to confront it as Europeans and as policymakers. And if we don't confront it, we'll end up with all of the institutions that we have, from startups to big companies, essentially, potentially being overtaken by Chinese capital, Gulf capital, Saudi capital, Japanese capital, American capital, you name it. Right? And we have seen some of those trends in the last few years. This is not a defense of some kind of economic nationalistic agenda. Right? I'm not suggesting that we should control those industries because they are German industries or because they are French industries. All I'm pointing out is that the more sophisticated next stage part of the story, which will require this kind of more sophisticated institutional innovation I would line afterwards, it pre-requires, as a necessary condition, the ability to somehow at least shape the path and the direction in which our digital infrastructure will develop. And unfortunately, until now, that infrastructure, by and large, is in private hands. That applies, by the way, to data. That applies to the nascent forms of artificial intelligence and robotics. And if there is no massive structural intervention of some kind that we might not like because it smells of corporatism or it smells of something else, we will just end up losing any levers of control over the situation. Now, you can, of course, think of many other background conditions that make this practice of this institutional innovation, as we did throughout the last 100 years, harder. Some of them relate to climate change. Some of them relate to a very difficult time that European states have coordinating and having a common strategy when it comes to taxation, when it comes to industrial policy, when it comes to issues where you would expect Europe to act as a common actor. So even though I will focus the rest of my remarks on trying to articulate what this new kind of social democracy or socialism might mean in the 21st century, it's obvious to me that quite a lot of policy interventions would be needed in order to even keep this playing space open. Because I can easily imagine that if nothing is done, right, and many of those measures we would not even like, there will not be any opportunity to engage in the kind of more radical structural social innovation that we would like to engage as social democrats or socialists. And unfortunately, that would mean that the neoliberal project will succeed in its ultimate goal. And here I have a very eccentric reading, perhaps, or somewhat non-traditional reading of neoliberalism. I define it in a very simple but elegant way. For me, neoliberalism is about preventing any other forms of non-market coordination from scaling up. So you can coordinate as much as you want in your family, you can coordinate as much as you want in your church, you can coordinate as much as you want in any other unit of social organization in ways that do not rely on markets and that do not rely on price. But the moment that you try scaling it up and it presents a threat to capitalist accumulation, neoliberalism will cut your head and you will essentially be taken out of action. For me, this is what neoliberalism is about. It's preventing ways of social coordination based on solidarity, on egalitarianism, and on values that have nothing to do with the logic of the market and competition from scaling up and occupying the kind of spaces that institutions like libraries, for example, currently occupy in society. Right? So if you were to think about what an alternative to the library would be with this neoliberal logic in mind, you would end up probably with people getting Kindles from 25 different digital companies and having to pay for the word they read and for the every laugh it produces, rather than going to the library and actually paying a yearly fee and being able to borrow as many books as you want, or paying for that actually with your taxes. Right? And I think this distinction and this insight is very important, because ultimately the neoliberal project is about constraining our very diverse repertoire of interventions to just one: competition. Right? So how do we solve a problem? We introduce more competition into it. That's not to say that competition is not bad or it should not be the solution, but very often it's presented as the default solution to many problems. And when it comes to big tech, I would argue that much of this debate right now that we are having, it's already heavily grounded in this neoliberal way of thinking or episteme, if you want. Because the solution to the problems that we are facing, it's articulated either through big tech, so Amazon will do it, Facebook will do it, or Google will do it, or conversely, it will be the startups that will do it. Right? There is very little space for imagining alternative configurations of social forces, be they trade unions, be they some kind of worker cooperatives, be they municipalities, be they some kind of national forces. There is very little effort that's being put at work to imagine what kind of legal, political, and technological infrastructure can prevent us to make those groups come together and work collectively and create joint projects which will and can rival those that have been designed before, whether those were those of the welfare state or of many of the institutions in its vicinity. And to me, unless we, those of us at least who care about social democracy or socialism, manage to articulate a proper political and very abstract vision. You know, I'm not hiding anything here. It's a very abstract vision because what we're missing is precisely that very abstract vision, which takes stock of the victory of neoliberalism. I don't think they have lost. I think they have managed to shrink our imagination quite successfully, as well as tie our hands in terms of what can be done. And the challenge right now is to survey this new digital landscape and ecosystem that has sprung up. And by looking at it, try to get some kind of a very basic and blurry outline of what a new set of those institutions might be, where we would be collaborating, where we would be producing new sets of knowledges, where we would be deploying a new kind of public goods, not just to promote solidarity, justice, and egalitarianism, but also actually to make our society more efficient and effective. And I know that this might sound very utopian, but just think about artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence right now is a field where 10 firms, 5 of them Chinese and 5 of them American, are dumping probably roughly 10 or 12 billion per company a year on research related to AI. Right? So if you look at the R&D spending, it's roughly in that range, and the vast majority of that funding goes to AI projects. Think about it this way. Does it really make sense for us to switch from an environment where you have 10 firms dumping this $100 billion into AI to a landscape where you have 100 such firms dumping perhaps $2 billion into AI? I think the answer is that it's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is how much of the current spending is completely wasteful. And I would argue that 90% of it is, because artificial intelligence is almost your classical public good, where you need to do it once and then make it accessible to others as infrastructure, and you will actually drastically reduce costs and potentially even increase the quality because you'll be able to take advantage of network effects. So if you look at artificial intelligence as it's being developed now, you have 10 companies developing essentially an identical set of skills for the algorithms and deep learning systems. All of them are training them to recognize photos of cats from photos of dogs, photos of traffic lights from photos of cars, photos of men from photos of women, photos of dark-skinned people from photos of light-skinned people. They're all replicating the same set of functions. There is no better argument for the wastefulness of capitalism than the current race for artificial intelligence. And I don't think the situation will get better if you simply increase, as I said, the number of firms from 10 to 100. Clearly here, a centralized approach where you actually conceive of this artificial intelligence as an infrastructure, where you actually engage in a very well-planned way of funding and developing it, then you understand that that infrastructure has a political economy behind it, And then you find a way to make it accessible in one way or another, and perhaps on different conditions, to different players in the economy. So that big companies will have to pay a higher fee, small companies will have to pay a smaller fee, NGOs and activists and startups perhaps will not need to pay anything at all. I mean, all of that suddenly becomes possible as long as we manage to do that one big step towards instituting it in some kind of a legal, political, and financial arrangement, right? Which is precisely the kind of social and institutional innovation that we should associate with the social democratic and socialist project. Unfortunately, I think our mental framework right now is so dominated by the everyday sins of these firms, them not paying taxes, them engaging in all sorts of shady lobbying in Washington and Brussels, them engaging in surveillance of activists and surveillance of people who actually criticize them, that we have a very hard time thinking at that higher, more abstract level and trying to relate those sets of interventions to the basic goals and functions of social democracy. This is where I think our absence, political and intellectual, currently lies. I absolutely have no doubt that whatever social democratic or socialist project we are going to build on the ruins, so to say, of big tech or Silicon Valley, it will need to resolve one big question, right? And that big question will be the ownership and control of the infrastructure that can then be repurposed for different projects. Right? We have built the welfare state on a very important assumption that certain services are so important to human flourishing and social solidarity that they have to be decommodified. That's why we have decommodified healthcare. That's why we have decommodified education. That's why we have decommodified transportation and a few other domains. Right? There was a very strong assumption of how decommodification of services and infrastructures relates to a set of a bundle of social goods that we would like to achieve. Unfortunately, capitalism has found a way to penetrate the most intimate domains of our existence, which extend far beyond healthcare and education. Right? To use a word, an expression that gets used a lot in German philosophy, it has colonized the life world. Right? And I think it's not an overstatement. Right? There has been a systematic effort to commodify every single part of our everyday life, our every single interaction with each other, with political institutions, with like-minded political groups, and so on. And it's obvious that a pushback against that is long overdue. And that pushback has to take the same shape and form of decommodifying this digitally mediated social relations to a point where the same sets of infrastructures, instead of commodifying our life more and more, could actually be used to decommodify them and actually build solidaristic egalitarian relationships and promote those values. That means that whatever project social democracy and socialism would morph into, I cannot possibly imagine how it can continue ignoring the crucial importance of having a strategy for reconquering and repurposing that infrastructure. And to be honest, I think we have to be very pragmatic, as I already said at the beginning, and we have to be very Machiavellian also when it comes to the tactics that under the current conditions, given the current composition of the European Commission, given the current composition of political forces in the European parliaments, given the overall electoral crisis of many social democratic parties, given all of that, we have to be very sober about what it would take to at least preserve the possibility of reconquering that infrastructure. Not to reconquer it, because for that, social democratic project is not ready. I think we also have to be completely clear that because of particular set of historical circumstances, this initial impulse towards institutional and social innovation that was part, it was part and parcel of social democracy, it has found its outlet in regulatory tinkering. Right? It has become all about regulation. And I think at regulation, we do a very good job. We built an entire European Commission informed by that idea, that we have the rules, we have to follow them, and we'll find ways to follow them. Right? Clearly, it's an attitude that does not lend itself to the sort of social innovation and tinkering with institutions and with their values that I've been calling for until now. Which means that every time you hear a politician associated with Social Democratic Party or with Socialist Party go on about regulation, you should applaud them, but you should ask them, what else are you planning to do, given the immense political, economic, and cultural challenge of digitization? And what kind of infrastructure and what kind of political and economic agenda do you have in store for actually enacting that program? And my feeling is that they don't, in part because they have found solace and they have found some kind of, a nice, comfortable hiding place among so many regulatory possibilities that European regulation offers them. And don't get me wrong, I'm not at all against regulation, but it will not get us the sort of victories that social democracy has won in the last century. And it will also not do it given that the composition of forces, both actual political forces on the ground and intellectual forces in the discourse that shape us, is not at all favorable to solidarity and egalitarianism. And the way in which the current system functions, right? And I've given the example of pension funds, to some extent being the beneficiaries of the current, you can call it financialized system. Right? But you can also think of other social democratic states. Think of Norway. Norway would now be in a profound crisis had its wealth fund not invested so much cash in many of those tech companies. And even though some of them have lost tremendous amount of value this year, for the last 4 or 5 years, they have paid the pensions of quite a few people in Norway. Right? So the idea that we can easily disentangle ourselves, right, from this mess, and we can adopt some kind of a nice technocratic regulatory agenda to do that, I think it's a myth. Right? What's missing, and what I think gives me some hope, to be honest, is a much more ambitious political project that can completely redefine what social democracy is in the 21st century. Because when I go to a lot of conferences like this one, and I've missed most of the discussions here, unfortunately, because I wasn't here yesterday and today I arrived too late, most of what I hear is characterized, as I've said, by a very defensive attitude, which is fine. There are things that we need to defend, and there are very important victories that the workers' movement and trade unions have won, and there are quite a lot of forces that would like to take them away. But that cannot possibly be the entirety of the socialist and social democratic project. Right? And I think that this encounter with digitization, this encounter with digital technology, does provide a life-saving opportunity for social democracy. Because ultimately it allows to completely reimagine what its attitude should be beyond just this very defensive stance of we would like to defend the welfare state as it was in 1950s. Right? And we would like to defend all of the institutions of co-determination and other similar interventions that we have built. By the way, all of this agenda that I've been outlining, maybe at a very abstract level, does not in itself preclude the possibility of even breaking up the big tech. Right? But I think social democrats, when they do it, they have to know why they're doing it, and they have to do it for the right reasons. And here, clearly, breaking up the big tech to have the small tech, right, is not the goal. It is the goal for many other forces. It might be the goal for the Liberal Party, it might be the goal for the Christian Democrats, but it possibly cannot be the goal of a Social Democratic Party. The goal for the Social Democratic Party should be something else, and that something else might in fact involve, and it will not even be possible without reducing the power of Google and Facebook. Right? So I don't think that a tactical alliance between people believing in social democracy and socialism and people insisting on competition, I think that that tactical alliance is possible, feasible, and might actually be necessary. The problem is that, of course, if the social democrats and socialists enter into this alliance without understanding all of the political and philosophical dynamics involved, they'll be swallowed by their adversaries. There is no way you'll do a better job talking about competition than the Christian Democrats or the liberals. It's just structurally impossible, and if you keep doing it, then the question is why you should even exist as a political party. You might be able to use it tactically and strategically to advance your own set of agendas and your own set of goals, but then the question should be, what are those goals? Right? And this is where I think there is an immense black hole in the agenda of social democratic parties, and there are maybe 3 or 4 years to fill it in, at best. And if that black hole is not filled in, I think a very, not just potentially life-saving, but a life-saving opportunity would be missed. Right? So again, it does not make me into a pessimist, in part because I think that there are exciting intellectual adventures that social democracy could embark upon if it frames this debate correctly. And I don't know why, in fact, it's not leading that debate. And I think the conjecture that I can make as to why it's not happening is because it has forgotten what has made it so great. That said, on a more pragmatic level, right, I think that the task for the next 3 or 4 years should be twofold. Right? One set of interventions have to be about specifying exactly what are those conditions of possibility, as I've said, that need to be in place for this new reconstituted social democratic project to even be feasible. That might mean a very different policy on data ownership. That might mean trying to roll out at least some prototypes in cities where a very different digital economy can function, where solidarity is at its heart, where citizen participation is there, where you actually don't just adopt some kind of a, how should I put it, a very hierarchical stance, where you think that the job of the people is to work in a factory, but you actually do promote genuine entrepreneurship, and you do promote people who can actually create a startup. But, you know, there are startups and there are startups, right? There are those that are predatory by default, and there are those that actually pursue a more noble set of goals and do it in a dignified manner. Right? So all of those things, I think, can be tried and should be encouraged, because ultimately, unless there are real working prototypes of some of these new digital infrastructures delivering those kinds of values that we want at the local scale, forget about convincing people to try them out nationally on a European level. So, you know, and for that, of course, we will need funding, and we will need willing politicians in power who would be willing to take risks and try them out locally, despite the opposition of the real estate industry, despite the opposition of people who would clearly be against, those working for Uber, Google, Amazon, and others, right? I mean, the moment you land in Berlin airport, like I did yesterday in Tegel, I mean, try to count how many ads you see for Uber or Google or Amazon before you reach your hotel. I can assure you there are quite a few, right? So clearly there will be a lot of political opposition. So this is where I don't disagree with the previous panel. I mean, these companies in this industry, they are very powerful, they know what they want, and they have the advantage of having their project almost completely map out on the neoliberal project of preventing any other non-market form of social coordination from ever springing up and actually scaling. So in that sense, the project and the task for social democrats is much more challenging and much more difficult. But in addition to this 2 or 3 years of accelerated experimentation, where we can dedicate some funds, we can dedicate some safe spaces, so to say, for this digital but not neoliberal innovation, we should also embark on a very ambitious intellectual journey of trying to rethink what social democracy in the 21st century would mean. And I'm afraid that none of the social democratic parties in Europe and none of them in the North America or Latin America have done that well. In part because they continue with the vision, which is dominated by their traditional partners, some of them trade unions, some of them citizen associations, some of them in the many other social groups, which is all well and fine, but that creates the sort of ideological and intellectual inertia that stands in the way of actually inventing the kind of forms of institutional and social association that would allow us to rebuild a vision for true social democracy in the 21st century. So if we manage to combine these two tracks, on the one hand, very practical hands-on experimentation, tied to a very pragmatic, policy-oriented set of interventions in Brussels. What is it that we need to be doing at the European level? Do we need a European tech fund of some kind to at least make sure that all of our tech industry does not end up being owned by Saudi Arabia, whose embassy, well, it's not their embassy, but you know that they are present virtually everywhere. In that sense, it's a very pragmatic question. It's not a question of centralization of power. It's a very pragmatic political question. How much time do we have? And do we have the right legal and economic structures in place to prevent that sort of thing from happening? Because if we don't ask those questions, there will be no ingredients for us to play with to build this alternative future. And the second track, just to repeat myself, is us being able to imagine what that future would look like and try to recover some of this more subversive, future-oriented strands in social democratic thought. And I think we have forgotten them, and we need to be able to recover them. And we need to be able to link it to institutions, and we need to understand what some of the preconditions should be for this rich kind of social institutional tinkering to actually take place. If we manage to achieve some progress on both of those fronts, I think there is a good chance that social democracy will not just survive, but will prosper. And because under the current conditions, you have to understand that despite that everything going so well for the neoliberal project, and despite the fact that companies like Uber, Airbnb, Google, and others are doing so much to entrench this idea of entrepreneurship and everybody being an entrepreneur and competition being the only way to resolve problems, they do entrench that ideology in our everyday interactions. Right? So there is quite a bit of help that the neoliberal project got from Silicon Valley. You have to understand that the externalities, right, or the costs of continuing with the current system are so high that even neoliberals don't know how to manage them. And markets can no longer solve that problem either, if they ever could. So you cannot just be creating markets for, solutions and then creating another set of markets for solutions. You end up with this infinite regression. You create more markets for solutions, and you end up still with the problems unsolved. And in fact, they accumulate. Right? So we should also not underestimate the solidity and the rigidity of the adversary. Right? So there will be tactical opportunities to move forward. But I think unless there is a clearly articulated idea, what is it that social democrats and socialists want? Given the highly globalized, financialized, and digitalized capitalism of today, we should expect no progress. Right? It's not a confusion about big tech. That is the cause of our problems. That's a confusion about the role and the meaning and the future of social democracy as such. And until that confusion gets cleared up, there will be no clear thinking about big tech. Our confusion about the tech industry, once again, is the consequences and not the cause of our problems. And if you really want to get a clear head on this, we have to get a clear head on what social democracy means under the conditions of 21st century capitalism. Thank you very much.